Welcome to the closing lunch of our second annual Climate Summit. I just got a text that said, Brooke, fair warning, there are burnt orange tablecloths. So I'm not sure who on the staff at the Texas Public Policy Foundation was in charge of tablecloths, but we will have to have a discussion. I'll have a lot of hands raised. No, welcome everyone, and please enjoy your lunch and the burnt orange tablecloths and all of the wonderful discussion that we've had over the last 24 hours. We're just so excited everyone's here, and I keep hearing from so many of you, this is the most extraordinary group of speakers and people I have ever seen together at one event, meaning all of our wonderful speakers. Could our speakers stand up, our panelists? I really want to recognize. Okay, no one's standing up. I know we have some of you here. They're okay, there are a few. You know, you look at the agenda, and I urge you to do this when you leave today and you're back on your plane or you're headed back to your office, because the collection that our team, led by Kathleen White and Doug Dominich and so many, the collection of thinkers and scientists and leaders and researchers that were put together over these last 2 days is nothing short of extraordinary. And I think we all realize, sitting in this room and listening to those panels, what an incredible opportunity to sit with some of the greatest minds in the world. So I'm so grateful. I wish I could introduce each one of you from the podium today, because you truly deserve that in your own field, but just know how grateful we are for your joining us in Austin, Texas. Right now, I'm going to ask to the podium Representative Paul Workman to bless the food. He, of course, represents House District 47 right here in Austin and has been there since 2011. He serves as Vice Chair of the Select Committee on State and Federal Power and Responsibility, and also on the Committee of Natural Resources. Very relevant to the discussion over the last day and a half is that he serves on the Energy Council, which helps facilitate the development of national energy policy amongst the southwestern states. Representative Workman is a great friend of this organization and is very aligned on so many of our big projects and important projects, and we're very grateful for his leadership. Please help me welcome Representative Workman.
Thank you, Brooke. Would you bow with me? Heavenly Father, I thank you for the Texas Public Policy Foundation and the work that they do on behalf of the citizens of this great state and this great nation. And I pray for the people that work at TPPF, that help to shape the policies. And I pray for those here today as they learn more about the important issues of our day. And for those of us who are elected officials, that we might have a clear guidance from you on your will for these policies. Now bless each person that's here. Thank you very much for this food and the hands that prepared it. And we'd ask you to lead Senator Cornyn in the work that he does and as he speaks with us today. And it is in your name we pray. Amen.
Okay, enjoy your lunch. Clearly, we think everyone needs to go on a diet because you've been given a very healthy lunch, but hopefully you'll enjoy it, and it'll be a little quick, but we'll get started right away. So thank you all. I'm sure everyone has finished their very light lunch and feeling very healthy, but I want to get started because we have the wonderful Senator John Cornyn here. But before I introduce Senator Cornyn, I just want to make a couple of quick comments. I think that in looking back over the last day and a half, we think, how do we summarize this, and how do we make sure that we're not just talking to ourselves? And what is the messaging point, and what do we take back to our communities and to the people that we're talking to as we begin, or really we continue to move America back to the truth and what real science says about this issue, and truly about energy, and especially fossil fuels, that at its core, it's about freedom. And that unleashing of human potential and the ability to dream conferred among even the least among us is truly what we defend at this organization, what I believe the Texas model is all about, and what is really at the core of the American dream. I'm proud to say that this organization has been at the front of that effort for 26 years now. 13 of those I have been here, which is hard to believe, but we have had the great mission of defending the Lone Star State, and understand that when we do that, we also defend the American dream. Our engagement on energy policy, you've gotten to see and meet some of our wonderful people. Of course, Kathleen White, I have to recognize just one more time, there she is, for her incredible work. Of course, she came to us 8 years ago after a highly successful stint as chairman of the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. And of course, we all have been talking about, but I want to remind you, her and Stephen Moore's book is coming out early next year, and Fueling Freedom, and we're so excited about that. Her team of scholars and the work that she does every day have achieved so much in defending free market energy. So thank you, Kathleen. I also want to take a moment to introduce one of the newer members of our team, Doug Dominich. Doug, will you stand? He is the former Virginia Secretary of Natural Resources. So I think Kathleen's counterpart in Virginia, he was really, I guess, Doug, in charge of this last day and a half. If so, did you order the burnt orange tablecloths? No. Okay, all right. What a gift to have Doug, all the way from Virginia, leading this effort to organize the states to push back against the federal government, and specifically with the EPA's unconstitutional Clean Power Plan. And what a gift to have you, Doug, and your incredible work and resume for this effort. And finally, I want to just introduce one other fairly new member of our team within the last year, the Center for the American Freedom, which is our litigation effort that we've mentioned a couple of times, led by the extraordinary Rob Henneke, sitting right here in front. Will you stand and wave at everyone, Rob? As you all heard, we filed our first lawsuit this week against the federal government on an issue involving land seizure by the feds along the Red River. And you may rest assured that in the year to come, we will be deeply involved in many of the topics and causes that we have discussed in the past 24 hours. We have litigation for the first time at this organization in our 26 years because we decided it was time that our side stopped ceding to the left the full power and might of the judiciary. And we believe that that effort, along with legislation and the public conversation and our great leaders like Senator Cornyn, is crucial to securing victory for liberty that will in time allow the great energy renaissance that we're already in, but to become even more so. And in doing so, will lift millions more people out of poverty into a better life. And let me just say one other quick thing. Thank you for the applause in the back. Let me just say one other quick thing. By the way, they work for me. That when we filed the lawsuit a couple of days ago, we also released a video, and you can see it. It's at redriverpropertyrights.com, and we've spoken for years on our side how we have to begin being so much better and effective at telling stories, at telling the stories of why freedom and liberty and conservative values matter. And it's not just about charts and graphs and research papers. It's about telling the stories of real people affected by these policies. And so our in-house filmmaker, Stephen Robinson, I don't know if Stephen is here, but he did an extraordinary job putting a short video, 5 or 6 minutes together, on the BLM lawsuit. We just released it a couple days ago, and we just today have hit 250,000 views on that video. And that is, for those of you that aren't in this world like we are every day, we had a video maybe a year ago from this summit that went sort of viral, and O'Reilly picked it as his video of the day, and that hit 20,000 views, and we were so excited about that. So for this video to hit 250,000 just a couple of really days into it means that we'll probably hit in the millions before it's all over, which again, to tell the story to real people so that Americans understand what's at stake is just extraordinary, but so important to our work. So thank you all for your great support. But let me say this, we have much more work to do, and it is not often that you can always rely on your leadership to do the right thing. And I am so grateful to call Senator Cornyn a friend. Of course, he's serving his third term in the U.S. Senate. He serves on the Finance and Judiciary Committees. You also probably know that he was elected by his peers to Majority Whip, which is the #2 leadership position in the U.S. Senate. How fortunate for our state. Prior to his election in the Senate, he served as a district judge, as a member of the Texas Supreme Court, and as Texas Attorney General. He has earned, fairly so, a great national reputation as being an articulate and powerful voice for Texas values. When it comes to energy, we know that he walks the walk. We are so grateful for his leadership. He has spent time in the oil fields of West Texas, Jim Henry, pipelines and refineries along the Texas coast, man camps at the Eagleford Shale, and even an oil rig 9,000 feet of water, 2 hours out into the Gulf of Mexico. In Washington, Senator Cornyn has used Texas's example of energy leadership and innovation to advance common sense energy policies. He has co-sponsored legislation requiring the Department of Energy to approve proposed LNG projects, has been an ardent proponent of the Keystone Pipeline, and most recently has been a leader in working to stop the Clean Power Plan in the Senate. He co-founded the Bipartisan Texas Caucus on Shale and Oil to educate members of Congress on the production issues in Texas and outside of Texas, and has helped lead the fight in the U.S. Senate to abolish the antiquated ban on exporting crude oil. I know he's no stranger to many of you in this room, and is someone who has been a staunch supporter and friend of this organization for many years. And I always like to say, Senator, and it's true, that of all the elected officials we work with, when we invite you, you always come and make such an effort to be with us, and we're so grateful for that. Help me welcome Senator John Cornyn.
Thank you very much. Let's hear it for the fabulous Brooke Rollins. Well, it's great to be with you today, and I have to tell you, Brooke, it's exciting to see TPPF flourish under your leadership and continue to grow. It's been a long journey from Dr. Leininger's dream in San Antonio to here in Austin, to this beautiful building and this world-class group of experts talking about something, one of the most important issues confronting our country today. But I just want to assure you that all of your time and your treasure and your efforts to help improve the public policy debates here in Texas are not lost on the rest of the nation. Not only do we get a chance to preach a little bit about the Texas model in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere, we're also taking other great work that you've done here and that Texas has done in the criminal justice area, for example, where we recently passed a bipartisan bill out of the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee, probably one of the most polarized committees in the Senate. I mean, Dick Durbin, Chuck Schumer, after all. But where you can find, actually, based on the successful Texas experience and the experience of other states, something that actually works and that you can then scale up and bring the benefits of that experience, that successful experience in Texas, to the benefit the rest of the country. So I'm really honored to be back here in Austin and to be with you here today to be part of a thoughtful and thought-provoking discussion about our nation's energy and climate future. I've found, like no doubt so many of you have, that too often discussions about climate change, for example, occur in a fact-free zone. You might say Washington, D.C. is a fact-free zone. And it's usually punctuated by dire warnings of catastrophe of some type or another. And I was thinking about that the other day when I heard Bernie Sanders say that climate change causes terrorism. Good grief. But I just want to recount a couple of stories. When I was growing up, there was a Stanford professor named Paul Ehrlich who wrote a popular book called The Population Bomb. Those of you who remember that book remember that Ehrlich's apocalyptic predictions included a warning that millions of people would starve to death because of overpopulation and the inability to grow the food supply to keep up with it. So, of course, his recipe was calling for immediate draconian measures in response. Does that sound familiar? So, what happened? How come it didn't come to pass? Well, the short answer is Norman Borlaug. Borlaug was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1970 because perhaps more than anyone else on the face of the planet, he was responsible for the so-called Green Revolution, including dramatic growth of global food production, which allowed the world to avert Ehrlich's now infamous forewarning of impending catastrophe. By the way, did I mention that he taught at Texas A&M? So keeping Professor Ehrlich and Dr. Borlaug in mind, how should we respond to these dire predictions about climate change? And I would suggest, as rational people, maybe we would want to ask a few pertinent questions, like, what are the costs of action or inaction? Does the government have the competence or the expertise to deal with it? What are the alternatives to new and expensive, complex government programs? And with such a great array of complex challenges facing our country, where does something like this fit in as a national priority? Now, if we were going to have a rational discussion, I think those would be some of the questions you might want to ask. So, this myopic focus, when talking about our energy future and focusing strictly on this issue of climate change, is to me a big mistake, because there's so much more that we could talk about. And I'll come back to climate change and dire predictions toward the end of my remarks. But thanks to old technology like fracking and relatively newer technology like horizontal drilling, America is in the midst of an energy renaissance. We all know that here, and many of you here in the audience have been part of that and been responsible for that leadership in that renaissance. So the United States is producing more oil and gas than ever, and it has been an unmitigated blessing to our country and to our state. And we've also, in the meantime, been able to diversify our energy sources. We still produce the most wind-generated electricity of any state in the nation, for example. And it's no secret that it is a result of innovators and pioneers right here in Texas. People like George Mitchell, and again, some of those of you in this room. But in Washington, our federal government seems stuck on stupid, chained by ideological obsession with climate models that look more like an economic forecast than they do real science, distrusting of our demonstrated ability time and time again to innovate ourselves out of so-called inevitable outcomes, and reluctant to reconsider outdated policies that stifle our economy and refuse relief to our allies abroad. Instead of appreciation and encouragement, energy producers, entrepreneurs, and job creators face a buzzsaw of rules, regulations, and executive orders emanating from Washington. And unfortunately, the current administration has set a new record. A depressing $670 billion, yes, that's with a B, not an M, billion dollars in increased regulatory costs since 2009. You want to know why the U.S. economy hasn't grown? Why the Texas economy in 2015 grew at 5.4% while the U.S. economy grew at 2.2%? That's one reason why. And of course, it's our energy sector that regularly bears the brunt of this overreach. And as you've been discussing, one of the most egregious examples is the so-called Clean Power Plan, which I know you've discussed extensively. But let me just summarize for you. Under guidelines handed down by the Environmental Protection Agency this summer, our nation must cut carbon dioxide emissions by almost a third in 15 years. Texas and other states are mandated to submit emission reduction plans by 2018. And if we refuse, well, the federal government has said they'll do it for us. The EPA has predicted that nationally, compliance costs will be as much as $7 billion by 2020, reaching almost $9 billion by 2030. To put it simply, some power providers are just not going to be able to operate under this plan, literally. Under President Obama's Clean Power Plan, perhaps as many as 20 Texas power plants will be shuttered, plants that reliably produce about 15% of our state's total generating capacity. We're in a growing state. People want to come here, but it means our population is growing, with more than 600 people a day moving to Texas and calling Texas their home. And our power grid is already stretched thin. Now is not the time to threaten our electricity supply. During August alone, ERCOT reported record-breaking hourly demand on 3 separate occasions, and that was just within 1 week. For Texas, a growing industrial state and the nation's leader in electricity production, this translates into a job-killing regulatory regime that will disproportionately hurt seniors and people on a fixed income, family and other families at a time when our energy needs are rising. And I would ask you, for what good reason? Study after study predicts negligible impact on global emissions, especially when developing countries like China and India aren't going to put a gun to the head of their growing economies. And the consequences for families and small businesses will be significant. One estimate suggests that Texans' electricity and gas bills alone could increase by 54%. As I mentioned, for those on fixed incomes who this is going to hurt the most, seniors and the working poor, these increases will be particularly hard, forcing them to spend more of their limited monthly income on their utility bills and less on food and other necessities. Make no mistake about it, if the EPA is able to fully implement these regulations, we'll see higher costs at the pump, at the supermarket, and on our utility bills. But fortunately, we don't have to take this lying down, and we are fighting back. I applaud Attorney General Paxton for the multi-state lawsuit challenging this plan. Unfortunately, what we've learned is that lawsuits alone, even when you win, it may end up being too late to change the behavior. Gina McCarthy, the head of the EPA, cynically acknowledged this. She said that basically by the time that the Supreme Court of the United States has finally resolved the litigation, investors have already moved on and financing has dried up. So that means we need to use every tool in our toolbox, including litigation. This week, the Senate passed a couple of measures that would stop the Clean Power Plan's restrictions on new and existing coal power plants dead in their tracks. We were able to do this through something called the Congressional Review Act, which prevented Harry Reid and his band from filibustering it and stopping the legislation from passing the Senate. Now, while we were able to pass both of these pieces of legislation under the Congressional Review Act, the fact of the matter is President Obama remains in the White House, and he will, in all likelihood, veto the legislation. But I think we need to keep the pressure up, and we need to maintain the visibility of this issue until we actually are successful. Recently, a Senate committee passed another piece of legislation that I supported called the ARENA Act that would limit the EPA's future ability to implement greenhouse gas regulations unilaterally. We also have another tool available to us in the end of the year omnibus appropriation bill that will have to be passed by December the 11th. And I might just add a little footnote here. Passing omnibus appropriation bills is a miserable way to do business. But for the first time, go ahead, clap. I agree with you. But for the first time since 2009, we actually passed a budget. And you have to pass a budget before the appropriations committees know what the top line number is that they need to appropriate to. And then individual committees, just like the Texas legislature, Paul, will work on appropriation bills, 12 of them in the federal government. And then you run those across the floor. People can offer their ideas. They can strike it. They can change it. They can try everything if they want, as long as they can get the votes to do it. And then it's ultimately signed by the president. That's the orderly, transparent, good government way to deal with appropriations, not an omnibus appropriation. But our Democratic friends, as we call them in Washington, D.C., realized that the best way they could create this big omnibus year-end exercise is to filibuster all of those appropriation bills. So that's why we are where we are, as ugly as it is. But budget writers do give us a chance to deny funding for some of these, to implement some of these regulations. And we're going to be working hard to roll back as many of these misguided regulations as we can, using, again, every tool in the toolbox, including budget writers on the omnibus bill. With the UN Climate Conference in Paris only a week away, you can be sure that we'll hear from the president on how his new progressive plan charts a course that the rest of the world should get in line and follow. But no matter what the president claims or says, or he promises that he can't deliver on the world stage in Paris, he can't enter into a binding international agreement that will extend beyond the next 13 months of his term of office as president without Senate approval. But we need to find policies as alternatives and solutions as alternatives that will work for folks here at home. And we should not be focused, as the president is, on pleasing the United Nations and those who've imbibed the climate Kool-Aid and who seem to just believe as an article of faith that catastrophic consequences will ensue unless we dramatically change our way of life, kill our economy and jobs, and grow costs for hardworking American families. And in the end, I think a lot of what this is about control. These regulations would give the government unprecedented control over states' electricity production and will strangle the private sector and do nothing to actually fix the perceived problem at hand. Indeed, the president's Clean Power Plan is just one more symptom of the polarizing, one-sided debate over climate change that the left seems to uncritically embrace. And while labeling skeptics climate deniers may fit their political narrative, it's not grounded in any kind of reality. And it is they who reflexively embrace big government solutions over science and innovation, which has always, if you think about it, come to our aid and helped us solve whatever the problem is at hand. So when the left uses this issue to attack the right, they actually don't show any indication they're interested in solving any problems, but unfortunately that may be the point, driving a political wedge rather than trying to build consensus and find solutions. Well, I want to make a confession. Maybe I've already alluded to this. I am a recovering lawyer, and I ask for your sympathy. But let's approach this issue on climate like a lawyer might in front of a court and stipulate, for the sake of argument, that the climate's changing and that human activity plays a role. Now, that may make some of you really nervous, but hang in there with me just for a moment. I just want to make this simple point. Of course, even if you stipulate to that, it is a far cry from conceding their concerns justify ineffective big government policies like cap and trade. Rushing to impose economically destructive and unrealistic measures that kill jobs and limit economic opportunity is not an answer. Instead, we should consider another example. When our nation encountered another environmental hazard. Let me take you back to the beginning of the 20th century when horses in New York produced 5 million pounds of manure each day. Talk about environmental hazards. This strained sanitation systems was piled up on empty lots. Can you think about summertime? And posed a large risk to the public health with rats literally feeding on undigested oats. Yuck. But fortunately, for New Yorkers, the problem was solved by not more taxes and not more regulation, but by innovation. The internal combustion engine, after all. Voila, problem solved. So my simple point is that America's engineers and entrepreneurs are simply more adaptive and ingenious than government regulators and bureaucrats. And they can and actually do solve problems. When the government tries to play savior, crushes dissent and debate, relies on taxes and regulation, problems aren't really solved but merely papered over. So instead of another EPA rule of dubious merit that disproportionately hurts lower and fixed income households, we ought to follow the example you've set here this week during this conference. We need to have these discussions and debates in a positive, constructive way. And embrace a balanced energy approach that fits the diverse needs of consumers, businesses, and a growing economy alike. But only when we encourage innovation-driven solutions will we be able to help the economy grow and the American people thrive with the energy they can afford. So those are just a few thoughts I wanted to share with you today. Thanks again, Brooke, to you and TPPF for inviting me here. And as time permits, I'm happy to answer or dodge a few questions. Yes, sir.
You mentioned using tools in the toolbox, and you were also talking about the omnibus bill that's coming up. What tools are available in that toolbox that might be directed at the EPA, particularly funding? Could something like something in there that makes it clear that they need to hold off on this clean power plan or it will affect their budget for next year? Could something like that be done?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, as a result of the filibustering of the individual appropriation bills, actually many of those individual bills have a whole litany of bipartisan riders because this is not strictly a concern of Republicans. Many, for example, coal state producing states, they share that concern, and there is bipartisan legislation to address it. But here's the biggest challenge we have, is that they all require a presidential signature. And that is the Madisonian conundrum that we have, that even with majorities in the House and the Senate, that unless we can get a presidential signature, then it won't become part of the law. But yes, it's within the control of the legislative branch to deny funding to implement any rule, including this misguided plan. One reason why the omnibus presents a somewhat of an attractive means to do that, despite what I said about omnibus appropriation bills, is that there's so much in there that there's going to be things the president and the other side wants. And so this will become a negotiation to see of how many riders we can include, including those that would defund this misguided plan. There's things like the waters of the U.S. that you're familiar with, this big power grab over private property rights that we've recently voted on congressional resolutions of disapproval on. All of that will be part of that negotiation. But in the end, it is a negotiation. I wish I were master of the universe and I could just do what I thought was the right thing for the benefit of all, but that's not the way our Constitution works.
Thank you for your words. And Amy Cook, Independence Institute, Colorado. Many of us are from different states. Explain from the federal perspective what it means for work in the states. What can we do to help aid your efforts?
Well, thanks for sending us Corey Gardner, by the way. That was a big contribution. And we're hoping you can do that again in 2016. And that's, I'm not kidding, that's really, really important. Well, I think, as I started out by saying, one of the great things about this organization and this assembly here today is the brain power and the ideas that are going to help us find a better alternative to the big government tax and regulation agenda of the left. They like big government. We don't like it so much, and we applaud and celebrate individual freedom and entrepreneurship and innovation. And I think part of it is the mainstream media, of course, wants to deprecate and malign anybody that doesn't sort of drink that Kool-Aid I was talking about earlier, that climate Kool-Aid. So we have to have better answers. And I think part of what TPPF has done and what the states have done is to come up with things that actually work, as opposed to more government, more taxes, more regulations. To me, that's the most important thing that we can get from the individual states.
One more.
Yes.
Senator, I'm one of your constituents, Melanie DeMayo. As a scientist myself, I was really surprised for some of the revelations that other scientists have given us over the past couple of days about global warming. In fact, it's a huge misconception, and I just would like to know what your encapsulated view of global warming is.
Well, after I took organic chemistry at Trinity University in San Antonio, I decided to seek a new profession. So I changed my major to journalism, and then ultimately went to law school. So I don't have your background or expertise, but from what I understand, essentially some of the models that these scientists have produced are not really science. What they're basically they're like economic models and predictions of the future. And I think Yogi Berra said something about predictions are hard, particularly about the future, or something along those lines. And the fact of the matter is what I tried to demonstrate, whether it's Paul Ehrlich and the population bomb, or dealing with this huge environmental hazard in New York with manure piled everywhere, and is that the answer is not to overreact and to say, well, the government has to do something. It is for the entrepreneurs, the scientists, the innovators to come up with a better solution, and they have. I think it's rhetorical as much as anything else. You're right. No, I mean, none of this is proven, right? It's all just a prediction about the future. And I've read as much as I can get my hands on, which indicates that what we're going through now is really pretty unexceptional in terms of the history of the world when it comes to warming and cooling and the like. But so much of this is really designed to grab power, because people want to control what you do and what I do and what the economy does, and it is it's what's more or less what's in fashion, not what's scientifically that you can establish. But unfortunately, it's not. As you know, science can sometimes be politicized too, and my experience is when science and politics mix, usually science is the loser.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Senator Cornyn. It's always such a pleasure to have your wise and thoughtful thoughts on all of these important issues. And while I was sitting there, it occurred to me I probably need to introduce the most important person in the room, and that is the whole reason that we're here. And about a year and a half ago, a supporter of ours that I know well and is a good friend said, Brooke, I think we really need to pull together the best and the brightest who are debunking the myth of climate change and global warming and the big thinkers in the country. And I said, well, that sounds great. And he said, I'll help make it happen, and let's see what we can do. And that ended up with the first summit last year in Houston. Today, again, the second summit here in Austin. And Bud Brigham, if you would stand up and let us thank you. There are, the founding of our country and the founding of Texas, it's a small group of people with big ideas and an unwillingness to give up that can really change the world. And I think, Bud, and your dedication to this issue is pretty extraordinary. So thank you for making this happen. As I mentioned on day one yesterday, Bud also has a movie out called My All American. So everyone can go see that as well. Not only is he trying to change the debunking global warming, he's also trying to change the culture in Hollywood. Two very easy things you've taken on, Bud, that I'm sure will be very successful. But thank you for making this happen, and so many of you too. What happens here cannot stay here. When Bob Murray left this morning, who of course spoke yesterday at lunch and is leading the lawsuit on behalf of his coal company, when he left here today, he pulled me aside and he said, Brooke, we're preaching to the choir. And I said, I get it. I really get it. But there are some encouraging things. And let me tell you, Even though there were only about 200 of us here, we had more than 1,000 people join us and are joining us via live stream, which is great, and have watched the proceedings over the last couple of days. But we also have had media that is covering this project in the last 2 days in the discussions we've had, including stories in Politico, Bloomberg, Washington Post, Washington Examiner, Bill Bennett's Morning in America, Austin American-Statesman, Houston Chronicle, Texas Tribune, The Hill, Daily Signal, NPR, and 2 links on Drudge Report. And that's just in the last 24 hours. That is tens of millions of Americans who are listening and reading and learning and discovering based on what you, the experts who've joined us in Austin in the last 24 hours, have made possible. And so please know that while it seems as if we may be preaching a little bit to our choir, that we are also changing the world and the way a lot of people think about this issue, which is why we're doing this. Everything you've heard over the last 24 hours about the indispensability of a free market in energy and a resistance to the alarmism and hysteria of the climate change cult is absolutely correct. And you know, there is an old saying, by their fruits you shall know them, and it is entirely accurate and applicable here. Look at the fruits of the proposed solutions advanced by the other side in this debate. It is always more government. It is always more spending. It is always more control. It is always less freedom. It is always less prosperity. In short, the other side inevitably seems to arrive at the conclusion, which they claim to descend upon with regret, that we simply must yield our liberties and our abundance in the face of their imperatives. Always, my friends, be suspicious of those who believe they have something to trade for your freedom. The bargain is never worth the price. This is one thing that I want to take away from this conference, that the other side regards human liberty as an intrinsic enemy of their agenda. But there is also another thing that I want you to take away, that same human liberty is the solution to the problems that they themselves identify. More freedom means more innovation, which in turn means, as we have seen now for decades, less pollution, cleaner air, bluer skies, and a more healthy environment for all. We have the luxury of being optimists, both because we are Americans, and that is simply our nature, but also because our optimism is empirically grounded. Our friends on the other side cannot say that. They look to the future and see only doom, but we know better. 417 years ago, a weary band of travelers crossing a bright and brutal desert were at their ends. They had run out of food, they had run out of water, they had eaten their animals and were straggling along, 500 of them, in the blazing sun on the baked earth. Several of them had literally gone mad with thirst. It seemed like the end for this small and desperate expedition of pioneers. Then, as if a miracle, they saw before them a great river and a lush oasis. They rushed forward and drank their fill, saved in the cruel desert by the surprise of a green ribbon of water and life coursing through the hard land. They rested, they recuperated, and on the 10th day, they gave thanks to God for their deliverance. It was April 30th, 1598, and though they did not know it, the Spanish expedition of Juan de Oñate was celebrating the first Thanksgiving in Texas. Next week, we celebrate our own Thanksgiving, and I wanted to mention that with gratitude for our blessings and our bounties, like the Spanish explorers of 4 centuries ago who came from a hard wilderness and discovered the abundance of Texas. We too have a duty to understand and appreciate the richness of the land and really the world we are given. We must receive it and experience it, not in the spirit of unwarranted pessimism or an un-American gloom and doom, but in the gratitude and optimism that are our inheritance and are our right. We look to the future and we see, in the words of Reagan, a bright dawn ahead. At the close of this 2nd annual Crossroads Summit, I invite you to the 3rd, to be taking place in a year, and I look forward to seeing that bright dawn with each and every one of you in an American future marked by energy and abundance and secured for generations to come. God bless you all, and thank you for joining us.